Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Becca Wasser, a senior policy analyst at RAND. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I appreciate you actually left your office early to come do this, so it's a double appreciation and thanks from me for making time to come down and talk to me about military deployments in the Middle East.
Oh, my pleasure.
I thought we would talk about sort of the American response to the increased tensions in the Persian Gulf. I would say perhaps over the past 6 months or 3 to 6 months, beginning with the Iranian linked attacks on international oil shipping near the Strait of Hormuz, and then the downing of a U.S. Global Hawk drone, and then culminating in the attack on the Saudi oil facilities. So I thought we would just start first, like the broad response before the attack on the Saudi oil facilities, how the U.S. has responded and what it's basically sent to the region.
Yeah, so the U.S. has really tried to approach it in 2 ways. The first is in response to the Iranian attacks on the oil tankers. They've tried to build a coalition of sorts to help protect safe passage of commercial shipping, which has to some degree been not quite as successful as they would have liked. There's been a bit of pushback about escorting vessels that are not from, certain countries, with every country being a little bit more willing to protect their own than to protect other countries' flagged ships. And there's also been some sticking points in building this coalition because the U.S. has insisted on linking it to its maximum pressure campaign, which many countries, particularly those in Europe, have had a bit of a problem with. So at some point, this even actually led to a dual-pronged approach where the UK was actually trying to create its own initiative that looked quite similar to what the US had. But the U.S. has actually had some good success pretty recently in the last week or two of building out this coalition further to include some of the regional partners that it has in the Gulf. In addition to this, there's also been a pretty sizable uptick in U.S. force presence, as well as deployments of various capabilities to the region. Right after these attacks, the first 2 big deployments that we saw, one was B-52 Bomber Task Force, which ended up going to Al Udeid Air Force Base in Qatar. And then also changing the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, which was initially on deployment in what's referred to as the 6th Fleet area of operations, switching that to the 5th Fleet, which is more broadly in the Middle East and the Gulf. So those were the big 2. And then they were actually followed by a number of other air and maritime deployments. So, there was an amphibious transport dock and a marine expeditionary unit that ended up following, as well as, some F-22, an F-22 squadron that also came to the region. But there's also been a pretty heavy land component. So here we've seen the deployment of a Patriot battalion, sets of troops, which, has been a bit, the Department of Defense has been a bit cagey about, what those troops are comprised of. But for the most part, it sounds like it's been a lot of engineer elements, as well as supporting staff for a lot of the Patriots that have since gone to the region. And then even more troops and even more Patriot batteries to have arrived and have been announced, as well as more recently some being put on prepare to deploy orders as well. So there's been a bit of an uptick to what was already a pretty sizable presence in the Middle East more broadly, but also in the Gulf, given the US's pretty extensive constellation of bases in that area.
Yeah, and I think maybe we should pivot now. This was in response to the Iranian attacks on ships and then the downing of the drones, but then there's also been other specific deployments that have followed after it's become pretty clear, although as of now there's been no military sort of kinetic response to the Iranian-linked attack on the Saudi oil facilities and Abqaiq and Khurais. So maybe you can get a little bit into the defense of Saudi Arabia, and then we could pivot towards to what this all means.
Sure. So prior to that attack, there actually was an uptick in deployments to Saudi Arabia. So the U.S. has had a bit of an on and off relationship with Saudi Arabia when it has come to questions of military access. The U.S. has had access to military bases in Saudi Arabia in the past, but for a variety of reasons, a lot of which have to do with Saudi leadership concerns over its domestic population and how they viewed U.S. force presence on their soil. Those have been revoked at various times. And the most recent time was after the Gulf War. The U.S. actually had the KAOC, which is, their air operations center for the region, based at Prince Sultan Air Base. So PSAB, as we usually call it, because you can't work with DoD or the military and not have an acronym.
Yeah, people think I'm terrible.
So the U.S. had its AOC, its KAOC, at PSAB, and eventually it lost access to PSAB. So the KAOC shifted from Saudi Arabia to Qatar in 2003, I believe.
Yeah.
And the U.S. lost access to PSAB more broadly. So prior to the attack on Saudi oil facilities, you actually had an announced return of U.S. forces to PSAB, which was going to be, I think, about an additional 500 or so troops, as well as sending a Patriot battery to PSAB. It was also noted by DoD that part of what they were doing at PSAB, this was a lot of different engineering elements because they had to upgrade the facility to make the runways work and to make it so that they had shelters, et cetera, all these things that they would need in order to bring fighter aircraft back to Saudi Arabia. So it looked like there were some F-22s that were earmarked for this, although I don't think they've arrived at the time in which we're talking. But that might be something that's still in the offing. But then, with the attack on, Saudi oil facilities, DoD announced that they were going to have another deployment to the kingdom to help defend Saudi Arabia. And so for this, they deployed another Patriot battery, some radars, as well as some U.S. troops and personnel to be able to support these batteries and these radars, even though, again, they weren't very specific about who these troops were actually comprised of. And then, as I noted before, they also put some additional forces on prepare to deploy orders. These were a mix of additional Patriot batteries as well as a THAAD. And so to date, Saudi Arabia hasn't used THAAD. They haven't hosted it. I believe Korea and the UAE are the only other two U.S. partners who have actually fielded that, even though I might be slightly wrong on that one. But at least
in Romania at one point. I think that one is sent to Romania at one point.
Probably for the rotational ABCT that the U.S. Army has there.
Yes.
And so, at least in the region, you've got the UAE as being really the only regional actor or military that's ever used the THAAD. So the fact that one is on prepare to deploy orders to go to Saudi Arabia, where the U.S. hadn't had any access and major military presence in since 2003, pretty big deal.
So, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm going to start with, so the PSAB build out began before, just to be clear, before the actual attack on the Saudi oil facilities, but after Houthis in Yemen had used Iranian ballistic missiles to strike targets in the kingdom. So do you think that this was a move to try and get a more robust American presence inside of Saudi Arabia to deter Iran, or was this more politics, within the intra-GCC politics. Maybe the Saudis are upset that they let the chaos get away from them and end up in Qatar, deepening the American relationship with Qatar when they're having so many problems with their neighbor.
So I think it's more about trying to deter Iran as well as Iranian-linked proxies. I think that's probably the major impetus for it. And, for Saudi Arabia to feel as though with U.S. troops on their territory, that if something were to happen, the U.S. has potentially more skin in the game. So in some ways, it's also an element of reassurance for Saudi Arabia to feel as though, if something were to occur, that the U.S. would come to their defense and would come to their aid. That said, I think you're exactly right to point to some of the internal politics of the GCC. It definitely doesn't hurt that now Saudi Arabia can also boast that it has U.S. military assets and troops on its soil. And, part of what we've seen other states trying to do, and particularly here I'm actually referring to the UAE, trying to sort of sweeten the pot for U.S. access arrangements in a bid to try and get the U.S. to start using some of their facilities. So the Emiratis have, pretty much changed their status of forces agreements to make Al Dhafra a little bit more accessible, and the UAE more broadly more accessible for U.S. troops, as well as trying to get the U.S. to use Al Dhafra Air Base much more so that the U.S. doesn't feel as though they have to solely rely on Al Udeid. And part of this is, the regional rivalries and the machinations of these states to try and make Qatar feel some of the pain that it wishes that they could exact on Qatar as a result of their more recent split. But, I think that's probably a secondary factor here for the Saudis. It's just sort of an additional benefit. But the real reason for, starting to build out PSAB again, which I believe was announced in mid-July, is really to have that deterrence, to have a deterrence presence, as well as to perhaps maybe have reassurance and to ensure more of a vested interest for the U.S. to come to their aid if anything should occur.
And so I think it's important then to pivot. A lot of people will say Saudi has lots of Patriot, so why is it that they want American Patriot to augment their own? Perhaps get into that a little bit, and perhaps maybe this frames sort of the discussion about how the United States envisions its future presence in the region, vis-a-vis its broader ambitions to try and, honestly, focus less on the Middle East and focus more on both Asia and Russia as places for military planning and military deployments.
Yeah, so for the reason for why Saudi Arabia is really been sort of pushing for more Patriots. The first is, right now, Saudi Arabia, their Patriot operators and the Patriots that they have in their arsenal, they're pretty overstretched. For the most part, they've been focused on protecting their southern border because of all of the rockets, drones, and other attacks that have emanated from Yemen. So a lot of their radars have been focused on the south. A lot of their Patriot batteries have been moved down towards the border, or at least are turned that way. So they don't quite have enough to be able to deal with that threat, as well as threats that are emanating from other areas. We tend to forget how large Saudi Arabia is geographically. I mean, it's a very big country. And so trying to spread the wealth, so to speak, it doesn't have enough Patriots to be able to do that. So this is why one of the reasons why they are trying to rely more on U.S. Patriots to help, sort of share that burden, if you will, to perhaps maybe free them up to look elsewhere. But you also have to remember that even though, yes, there will be more U.S. Patriots in Saudi Arabia, they're also going to be making sure that they are focused on providing coverage for where U.S. troops are. So, there's definitely going to be a Patriot tied up protecting PSAB. The other reason why Saudi Arabia probably wants Patriots is because they only have so many Patriot operators, and their Patriot operators are only so good. Saudi military effectiveness more broadly leaves a little bit of something to be desired. And while they have very good Patriot operators that are part of the Royal Saudi Air Defense Force, they're still not quite up to snuff in comparison to U.S. Patriot operators or, from some other more practiced allies and partners. So that might be another reason why they are pushing for more U.S. Patriots to be in Saudi Arabia. As for sort of what this does, I mean, I think, again, just if we're going to keep on the example of the Patriots, I think this is a great one when we want to talk about what U.S. interests and priorities are and how some of the more recent events in the Middle East perhaps take the U.S. farther away from implementing some of the priorities that have been laid out in the National Defense Strategy. In October 2018, the U.S. actually removed 4 Patriot batteries from the CENTCOM AOR. And so these came from Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. And since all of the events that kicked off in about May, a lot of these batteries, and perhaps even more, have actually been returned to the CENTCOM AOR. So these batteries were initially removed so that they could be freed up to go to Europe or to go to Asia as part of, the U.S. efforts to better counter Russian and Chinese influence, as part of what the NDS lays out, with great power competition being the top priority for DoD. And despite these best laid plans, these Patriots have returned to the region. So in some sense, they're not focused on trying to counter Russia and China. They're focused on trying to counter a regional adversary, which is a lower tier priority in the NDS, if I'm going to be entirely frank about it.
I mean, they wrote it. We didn't. We just read it. Iran is definitely down there. It's not nearly as high on the list as China or Russia. And I think that so we were like narrowly using the Patriot example for like the defense of Saudi. I mean, I think it's important just for listeners who may not know as much about Patriot as you, is that their radars are. I've read 120 degrees versus 180 degrees, but basically they aren't 360 degrees, so they can't see everything all at one time. And so when you have a bunch of threats on your southern border, you point them down south, which leaves your northern side vulnerable. And Patriot's not area defense; it's sort of point defense. And so that's why I assume that they have a THAAD on the potential to deploy list. I'll simplify it a little bit because THAAD would be a little bit better to provide more coverage. But if we wanted to zoom out, because we started this conversation with the sort of American response towards Iranian provocations of international shipping and the shoot down of the Global Hawk. In many ways, there are similar sort of costs associated with what we've had to do to send stuff back to the CENTCOM area of responsibility. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Maybe some of the ways it strains the force, or at least doesn't free the force up to focus on, again, Russia and China as the NDS lays out?
Yeah, so one of the big things that folks haven't really been talking about all that much is the ways in which this strains the force in terms of readiness. So readiness is a big thing for really effective militaries to have, which is being ready to fight the next fight, if you're going to put it down to the simplest terms. And with the NDS essentially telling the United States and the US military to prepare for a potential war with China or Russia, which are two near peer, if not peer competitors in the military arena, readiness is really important. So by sending all of this equipment and sending all of these troops to the Middle East, that's time that they can't really spend to try and rebuild readiness, which is, regenerating some of the basic skill sets that they need to have. Even just for, if we're talking about US troops, just even rest time and spending time with families. These things are quite important if you want to have a set of soldiers who are, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to fight. And so by having so much equipment being focused now on going to CENTCOM rather than being able to spend time rebuilding readiness, you're actually degrading the ability of your force to be ready to fight that next fight. And that's really important. And then, for certain capabilities, again, the Patriot, but also, special operations forces. So these are low density, high demand items, for lack of a better term. They're spread pretty thin. And therefore, their readiness is going to end up degrading the most, because they're going to have the least amount of time to be able to regenerate. And so these are some of the sort of hidden costs that people don't quite realize when we talk about these deployments, and ones that really matter for the US military's ability to carry out some of the NDS priorities.
So, just final thoughts here. As we essentially build out and regain access to PSAB and the maritime force that you described at the beginning, it sounds like it's gaining more momentum just from reading the news, from the Twitter feed of the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Defense Esper. And, it just seems like all of the efforts trying to reduce the focus on the Middle East isn't really coming to fruition, largely because events in the Middle East won't allow it. So if you had to sort of make some policy recommendations, or if you had to sort of think through what the United States should be doing, given that tensions with Iran are likely to continue throughout the Trump administration, probably into whether a second term for the Trump administration or a different president on the Democratic side, what is it that needs to be done to actually be able to implement the recommendations in the NDS and to focus more on readiness and larger great power rivals to the United States?
So, the first and most basic thing is, if you are going to prioritize, you need to stick to those priorities. And that's hard to do, right? So if you've sort of drawn a line in the sand and said, Russia and China are the top two priorities, you're going to have to make some choices on the basis of that are going to be really, really painful. And so while you can have partner nations who are perhaps coming to you and being very concerned, and for good reason, you also have to take a look at the larger strategic picture and what your aims are, and see if some of the things that they're asking of Washington, of DOD, of even smaller than that, the US Army, is it in strategic interest to actually do those things? And if they're not, you have to be willing to say no. And that's really hard to do, and that's really, really difficult here. I think one thing that we tend to forget, even though it's sort of one of those, it's quite axiomatic, but the enemy gets a vote. So in this case, Iran has gotten a vote. Iran has said, hey, you think that you can pivot to Asia and you can go back to Europe, but you know what? We're going to do things here that are going to require you to turn back to the Middle East. And that's been really, really hard for the US to adapt to in some cases, and be able to actually deal with both sort of the long-term threat and the near-term threat. And so kind of sticking to some of the priorities and making these hard decisions about what is worthwhile and what is not, it's tough to do, and you're going to end up upsetting a lot of different partners in the meantime. But there's ways in which you can still do it while having what we refer to as an economy of force. So, perhaps maybe that's not going to be as many boots on the ground, but perhaps focusing more in the maritime domain where there's been a lot of threats and there's been a lot of attacks, or perhaps maybe trying to do things like increasing ISR to be able to better call out when there are potential attacks or things that are about to happen. There are different ways in which the US can reduce some of what it's doing, but still maintain its strong role in trying to deter, but maintain credibility in what that deterrence is. Because right now it seems as though there's been a lot more of the reassurance efforts than deterrence. And that over time is going to erode US credibility, not just in the Middle East and not just with Iran, but you bet that Russia and China are paying attention to what's happening here. So that would sort of be my wrap up best recommendations.
Well, I think as always, people listen to this podcast and then they immediately implement what we say. So we have a high record of success on the Middle East Brief. So I appreciate you you taking the time on a Friday and coming in to chat, or at least leaving the office, going home so that we could connect on Skype so that we could chat. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks again for having me.
Always a pleasure, and thanks everybody for listening.